did not murder his wife. Maureen Argie's death was not a homicide. It was a suicide. You see, in the middle of the night, in a moment of desperation, Maureen Argie did a terrible and tragic thing. We may never know exactly why she did what she did. She left no note explaining her decision. She told no one of her plan. All we know is that on April 3rd, 2019, Maureen Argie went upstairs alone. She went to bed alone, and she killed herself alone. Maureen Argie's death was not a homicide. It was a suicide. Now, you may find yourself asking, what about this alleged solicitation of a hitman that the state walked you through? What about the medical examiner's conclusion that this was, in fact, a homicide? Those are exactly the sorts of questions you should be asking yourselves, and they will be addressed. But for right now, let me tell you what happened. On April 3rd, Maureen worked late. Bill picked up the kids from school, he fed them dinner, he helped them with their homework. Maureen came home before 8 in time to say goodnight to Gavin and Ella, before Bill read them their bedtime story, kissed them goodnight, and shut their bedroom door. Back downstairs, Bill and Maureen sat down to talk. They didn't fight, not at first. They talked about the kids. They talked about the state of their marriage. They were sad and they were heartbroken, but they knew this marriage could not be saved. At some point, though, the conversation took an ugly turn. Bill put his foot down. He said this divorce was going to happen, but Maureen was not going to dictate its terms. This was going to be a fight. Custody of their children was going to be a fight. Control over the sale of the house was going to be a fight. Division of assets, many of which were in Bill's name, was going to be a fight. There was not going to be a peaceful resolution, not anytime soon. Bill didn't wait for a response. He went downstairs into the basement, he went out the basement door, took a walk, got some air. When he came home, he let himself back in through the basement door, and he fell asleep on the couch. He didn't go upstairs until the next morning. On the morning of April 4th, Bill woke up, made his way upstairs to get dressed and get ready for the day. And when he opened the bedroom door, he found Maureen. Her body was wedged between the bed and the nightstand. A sheet was wrapped tight around her neck, the other end tied to the bedpost. There is no script for how to respond to a scene so awful. I don't think any of us can know how we might react. Bill didn't cry out, didn't break down. In that moment, a single thought rang clear. He could not let the children see their mother like this. So he removed the sheet, placed Maureen back in the bed, and covered her with a blanket. Next, he had to get Gavin and Ella out of the house, as far away from this as possible. Imagine the strength it must have taken for Bill to keep it together as he woke up the kids, as he made them their breakfast, as he got them ready for school. Just get the kids on the bus. Get them as far away from this as possible. Bill packed Gavin and Ella's book bags with clothes for the night. He wrote a note that his mother would be picking them up and put it in Gavin's bag. He walked them down the driveway and waved goodbye as they got onto the school bus. Back in the house, Bill's shock gave way to profound regret. Regret that his last words to Maureen were spoken in such anger. regret for the sort of husband he was to Maureen, regret for missing the signs that this was coming. Maureen's suffering was often turned inward. She was a very private person, did not share her feelings readily. But Bill knew she had a history of depression. And he knew that the past few months had been especially stressful on both of them. And the night before, he pushed her too far. The reality is, he did not see this coming. No one did. In that moment, all he wanted was to be able to trade places with Maureen. If only he could somehow bargain away his loss. So Bill went to Home Depot and bought a pair of box cutters. He came home and made 2 long, deep incisions, one up each arm. He lay down on the bed beside Maureen and closed his eyes. But to his surprise, Bill woke up a few hours later. His actions upon waking may be hard to understand, and the state will paint his choices as evidence of a guilty conscience. But again, life hands us no script for how to react to tragedy. And Bill's choices were a reaction to tragedy, not to murder. He woke up in a room covered in his blood, his deceased wife in the bed next to him, and as that scene came into focus, he could see this did not look good. His actions in the hours that followed are evidence of a shocked conscience, of a traumatized conscience, but not a guilty one. Bill bandaged his wrists, threw some clothes in a bag, and got into the car. In a daze, he drove to Connecticut, to the Foxwoods Casino. Bill was an addict, and gambling was his drug of choice. We might expect a person addicted to drugs or alcohol to use or drink in times of crisis, and this was no different. Maureen's sudden and unexpected death was simply too much for Bill to bear. And so instead of feeling his grief, instead of feeling his regret, Bill went to the casino. The casinos are designed to feel like a kind of refuge from the outside world. You step into a casino and you quickly lose all track of time. There are no windows to the outside, no clocks hang on the wall, no news plays on the televisions. The lighting is dim and artificial, the sounds hypnotic and constant. Anything you might need, food, drinks, entertainment, is all within arm's reach. You see, the very business model of a casino requires customers to keep on playing through their losses. That's how casinos make a profit. By their very design, casinos provide customers with a kind of anesthesia. Short of death or sleep, Foxwoods allowed Bill to shut his eyes and wish it all away. Of course, we cannot escape forever. The following day, tribal police arrived for Bill. And the first thing Bill said when they got there, "I'm so relieved you found me." When we lose a loved one, we crave answers. We demand to know, how could this have happened? Who is to blame? When Maureen died, Bill was an easy target for that blame. The well against Bill had long been poisoned. You see, the Argie marriage had long been on the rocks, and despite his love for Maureen, Bill was not an easy man to be married to. Bill suffered from a debilitating gambling addiction that wreaked havoc on the Argie family. Maureen and Bill were under serious financial strain as bills went unpaid, mounting debts incurred. Maureen confided in friends and family that Bill was draining their bank accounts, that he was spending more and more time away from home, at the casino or in the poker room. Maureen had tried taking Bill to therapy. She tried controlling the finances. She even tried staging an intervention with friends and family, but it was no use. Bill's gambling only grew more and more out of control, and Maureen could not enable him anymore. After years of fighting with Bill, fighting for this marriage, Maureen was finally done. In the spring of 2019, just months before she died, Maureen decided she was not going to fight anymore. She was leaving Bill, and she was taking the children with her. Maureen was resolute, but she could not do this alone. Before she even told Bill she was leaving, she went over her plan with friends, relatives. She rehearsed what she would say, took down notes. Maureen knew if she didn't plan out every last detail, she might lose her resolve. If even one piece of the puzzle didn't work out, the whole plan would fall apart. And so, every detail was carefully coordinated. Maureen would need to sell the house they could no longer afford, so her father was going to help with small repairs and get it ready to be put on the market. Bill's sister offered to help repaint the walls. Maureen would need a place to go, so she arranged to move in with Bill's mother. There, the kids would have their own rooms and could stay at their current school. Maureen would need a place to store what belongings wouldn't fit at Bill's mother's, so a friend offered up her basement. Maureen would need help packing and moving box after box, and so a caravan of friends and family was arranged. But then, Bill made his promise. He was not going to make this easy. If Maureen wanted to take anything from him, she would have to fight. Fight for the kids, fight for the house, fight for the car. And Maureen didn't want to fight anymore. She had fought for the marriage long enough. To fight to get out of the marriage was simply too much to bear. The well against Bill had long been poisoned. Every family member, every friend, every co-worker knew that Maureen was leaving. Many of them knew before Bill even did. And so when Maureen died, their first impulse was to blame Bill. Many of them already blamed him for the downfall of the marriage. It was only natural to blame him for her death, too. Now, what about Bill's attempted solicitation? Like the state described, you will hear testimony from a man named Jamie Timbus, who swears that Bill solicited him to commit murder for hire. But I ask you to consider the source of that information. This story comes from the owner of a club where Bill lost thousands upon thousands of dollars. This story comes from a club owner who watched on as his so-called friend lost thousands upon thousands of dollars. What better way to assuage his guilt than to blame Bill for this tragedy? So first thing in the morning, when he hears about Maureen on the news, Jamie calls the police. Tells the police he thinks Bill murdered his wife. Says Bill tried to get him to find a hired killer. When you hear Jamie Timbus' story, ask yourself why he cannot document when this supposed conversation even happened. If Jamie's story is true, if Bill's reason for meeting up with him that evening was murder, then why didn't Jamie call the police that night? Because Bill said he was just kidding? Because Bill spends money at his club? Jamie didn't call the police that night because this conversation never happened. Jamie Timbus is lying. Now, what about the medical examiner's conclusion that Maureen's death was in fact a homicide? The pathologist on this case had been out of training and on the job for 2 years at the time of Maureen's death. This was her first autopsy involving asphyxiation. The pathologist's job is to look at the physical evidence, to examine the body, how it's positioned, what injuries and markings are left behind, and to draw her conclusions from that physical evidence alone. This is scientific. This is objective. But the pathologist's notes here make clear When she arrived on scene, before she even had a chance to look over Maureen's body, she was told the couple who lived here were going through a contentious divorce. Like Maureen's friends and family, the police had arrived at their conclusion before the investigation even got off the ground. That well had long been poisoned, and the pathologist relied on that conclusion before she even began the autopsy. The nature of senseless, tragic deaths is that in their wake they leave more questions than answers, more confusion than clarity, more doubt than certainty. At the end of this trial, you will be left with doubt, with reasonable doubts that the state cannot clear up for you. You will be left with doubts about an inexperienced pathologist's conclusion that this was a homicide. You will be left with doubts about the credibility of a club owner trying to protect the integrity of his business. You will be left with doubts about Maureen's resolve, about her belief in a future of her own making. All of these doubts will amount to reasonable doubt as to whether the state has met its burden. On April 3rd, 2019, Maureen Argie went upstairs alone. She went to bed alone, and she killed herself alone. Maureen Argie's death was not a homicide. It was a suicide. And at the end of this trial, we will ask you to find Bill Argie not guilty.